The year is 410. The last Roman soldiers have boarded their ships and sailed away from the misty shores of Britain. They leave behind more than empty forts. They leave a void, a profound silence where once the machinery of an empire hummed. And into that silence comes a new sound, the creak of oak hulls on water, the whisper of sails catching a North Sea wind. This is where our long journey begins. A journey that will span centuries, a tapestry woven with threads of conquest and prayer, of blood spilled on battlefields and ink on sacred parchment. Tonight, as you sink into your rest, let me tell you the epic story of medieval England. It is the tale of how a fragmented land became a kingdom, how that kingdom faced fire and steel, and how, against all odds, it began to dream of itself as a nation. So close your eyes. Let the present melt away. And travel back with me to the edge of the Dark Ages. Picture the eastern coastline, exposed and vulnerable. The Romans called it the Saxon shore, and now, as if summoned by that very name, shapes move in the gray waters. Long, slender ships with carved prows cut through the swell. These are not the ordered cohorts of Rome, but small, independent warbands of Angles, Saxons, and Jutes. They come not as a single conquering army, but as a slow, relentless tide of migration. They are driven by hunger for land, pushed by changes in their distant homelands, and pulled by the fertile promise of a Britain left undefended. They bring with them their gods of thunder and war, their language, the rough, beautiful ancestor of our own, and their fierce loyalty to the Lord who leads them. They come to stay. What did the people who remained of Roman Britain see, I wonder, as they watched those sails appear? Some, clutching the fading embers of Roman law and the new flame of Christian faith, retreated westward into the wild mountains of Wales and Cornwall. Others stayed, facing an impossible choice between resistance and adaptation. In the crumbling villas and abandoned towns, a blended world began, painfully and slowly, to form. It is from this turbulent, shadowy time that the first faint echoes of a legendary name arise, Arthur. Not the golden king of later tales, but perhaps a war leader, a man of the old Roman order desperately trying to hold back the advancing dawn of a new age. Whether he was one man or a memory of many, his story speaks to that moment of profound loss and fragile hope. The world that did emerge was shaped by the newcomers. Kingdoms rose, not based on imperial bureaucracy, but on the raw, personal bond between a lord and his warriors. The king was not a distant emperor but the mightiest fighter, the ring-giver, who earned loyalty through courage and generosity. Life was precarious, beautiful, and brief. In the great mead halls, firelight danced on wooden pillars, illuminating the faces of men listening to the poet's song. The scop's voice would rise and fall, telling of heroes who faced monsters in the night, of glorious deeds and inevitable fate. In stories like that of Beowulf, they weren't just being entertained, they were deciding what it meant to be brave, to be honorable, to be remembered when the hall finally burned and the king lay cold. Their gods reflected this world. Tiw, the one-handed god of justice in battle. Woden, the wise and wandering seeker of knowledge. Thunor, whose hammer was the crash of thunder. Frigg, who blessed the harvest and the hearth. These were not all-powerful, serene beings, but figures who themselves struggled against fate, who knew that even the gods would one day fall in a final cosmic battle. It was a faith of courage in the face of darkness. Yet, even as these pagan kingdoms put down roots, another force was stirring, moving from a different direction. Far to the north and west, on rocky islands battered by Atlantic waves, Christian monks in Ireland and Scotland had kept learning alive. In their isolated monasteries, they preserved not only the Gospels but the wisdom of the ancient world. Their Christianity was one of deep personal piety, fierce scholarship, and a burning desire to spread their faith. And so, as the 6th century wore on, these Celtic missionaries began to journey south, carrying their gentle revolution into the heart of the Anglo-Saxon lands. The conversion was not a simple swap of one belief for another. It was a long, intricate dance. When a missionary like Aidan arrived in a place like Northumbria, he did not find blank slates. He found a rich culture with its own laws, art, and wisdom. The challenge was to weave the Christian message into that existing tapestry. A story is told of King Edwin of Northumbria, pondering this new faith. He compared a pagan life to a sparrow flying through a king's hall on a stormy winter night. For a moment, the bird is safe, warm, and in the light. Then it flies out the other window, back into the unknown dark. Christianity, his advisor suggested, offered a hope that there might be more than just darkness waiting beyond the hall. Can you hear the power of that metaphor? The old way valued bravery and dignity within life's fleeting warmth. The new way promised that the story did not end when the sparrow vanished. It was a monumental shift, happening kingdom by kingdom, ruler by ruler. Some kings converted from genuine belief, others for political alliance, still others influenced by a Christian queen. The result was a patchwork of belief that needed unifying. That unity was decided at a crucial meeting, the Synod of Whitby in 664. Churchmen debated seemingly small matters, like the correct date for Easter. But the real question was this: would England look to the Celtic Christian tradition or to the authority of Rome? The decision for Rome would tie England's spiritual future to Europe, opening doors to continental learning and organization. And what learning followed? In the great monasteries of Northumbria, like Wearmouth and Jarrow, a golden age blossomed. In scriptoriums lit by candlelight, monks bent over vellum, creating masterpieces. The Lindisfarne Gospels, with their breathtaking, intricate designs, are a perfect marriage of Celtic artistic genius and Christian devotion. And in his cell at Jarrow, a monk named Bede was writing. His Ecclesiastical History of the English People did more than record events. It did something revolutionary. It began to tell the story of the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes not as separate tribes, but as one English people. A new identity was being born, not on the battlefield, but in the quiet of a monastery. This was a world of growing sophistication. Kingdoms like Wessex, Mercia, and Northumbria developed laws, traded, and grew strong. English missionaries now crossed the sea to convert their former pagan cousins in Germany. It seemed a fragile but brilliant dawn had broken over England. But from across the North Sea, where the fjords cut deep into the land, a shadow was growing. A different people, with different gods and a different code, were perfecting their own ships and sharpening their axes. They too looked westward, and in the year 793, the shadow fell. The target was not a royal fort, but the holy island of Lindisfarne itself. The Vikings had arrived. The peace of Lindisfarne was shattered by a sound unknown to that holy place, the dread creak of dragon-prowed ships grounding on the sacred shore. From the morning mist emerged warriors who worshipped different gods, men from the fjords of Norway and the flat coasts of Denmark. They moved with a terrible purpose. They knew these isolated monasteries held the greatest treasures, golden crosses, jeweled book covers, and silver chalices, all undefended. The attack was not random violence, but a calculated strike at the very heart of English spiritual life. The monks, whose world was one of prayer and parchment, were no match for axes and iron. The Vikings took what they wished, burned what remained, and vanished back to the sea, leaving behind smoldering ruins and a kingdom trembling with a new kind of fear. This was only the beginning. The raids became a terrible rhythm of English life. The Viking longships, with their shallow drafts, could sweep down the coast or slide far upriver, striking deep inland where no one expected seaborne terror. They came for plunder, captives, and land. By the middle of the 9th century, the seasonal raids hardened into permanent conquest. In 865, a great heathen army landed, led by fearsome brothers like Ivar the Boneless. This was no raiding party, it was an engine of conquest. Kingdom by kingdom, the old Anglo-Saxon political order crumbled. Northumbria fell. East Anglia fell, its king, Edmund, martyred for his faith. Mercia was overrun. Only one kingdom remained, backed against the western sea, Wessex. And here, at the brink of total dissolution, the English story found its unlikely architect. He was a young king, bookish and afflicted with illness, who came to the throne in 871 amid unrelenting defeat. His name was Alfred. When we think of great rulers, we often picture triumphant generals. Alfred's greatness was of a different, deeper kind. He understood that defeating the Vikings required more than winning a battle. It required reimagining what England could be. He had to build a nation where none existed. His resolve was tested almost immediately. In the winter of 878, a Viking force under Guthrum launched a surprise attack at Chippenham. Alfred's court was scattered, and the king himself became a fugitive, hiding in the watery marshes of Somerset with a handful of loyal men. From this lowest point, he began to weave recovery. How does a king, stripped of his hall and his army, rally a people? He sent out messengers, lighting the ancient beacon chains, whispering a simple, powerful message. The king lives, and resistance is possible. And the people, from thanes to farmers, began to come. They came not just for him, but for the idea of something to defend. The battle that followed at Edington was not won by superior numbers. Alfred's force was smaller. It was won by the desperate courage of men fighting for their homes, their families, and a future they could not quite see. The Viking shield wall broke. Guthrum was routed. But here, Alfred showed his true genius. He did not pursue a war of annihilation. Instead, he offered a treaty at Wedmore. He demanded Guthrum's baptism, with Alfred himself standing as godfather. Think of the profound symbolism of that moment. The Viking warlord, kneeling in water, adopting the god of the people he had tried to destroy. It was a masterstroke of political theater that began a long, slow process of assimilation. The Viking settlers in the east, in the region that would be known as the Danelaw, kept their own laws but gradually absorbed English ways. Meanwhile, Alfred looked inward. He saw that a kingdom could not survive on courage alone. It needed a mind and a soul. The Viking raids had destroyed the great monasteries, the repositories of all learning. So Alfred, a king, personally began to translate key Latin works into English. He established schools, arguing that even the sons of nobles should learn to read and write in their own tongue. His most enduring creation may be the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, a year-by-year history written not in scholarly Latin, but in the vibrant, living language of the people. For the first time, English folk could read their own story in their own words, connecting themselves to a past that now felt shared. His reforms were thorough. He issued a new law code, the Dambach, blending the best customs of various kingdoms with Christian principles of mercy. He reorganized the military, creating a rotating system so the land could still be farmed while the kingdom was defended. And he built a network of fortified towns, called Buzz. These were not just forts. They were planned settlements, with regular streets and markets, designed to be centers of trade and safety. They became the seeds of new towns, fostering commerce and a sense of collective security. Alfred's work was carried on by his children and grandchildren. His son Edward the Elder and his daughter Ethelflaed, the Lady of the Mercians, pushed the frontiers back, reclaiming land from the Danelaw and extending the Besistum. The process reached its climax under Alfred's grandson, Athelstan. In 937, at the brutal Battle of Brunanburh, Athelstan defeated a grand alliance of Vikings, Scots, and Welsh. The old poem in the Chronicle sings of the carnage, claiming, "Never yet in this island was a greater slaughter of a host made by the edge of the sword." It was a Pyrrhic but decisive victory. For the first time, one king could claim to rule over all the English people. The 10th century that followed was a golden age. Monasteries rose again, more magnificent than before. Art and manuscript illumination flourished, creating wonders like the benedictional of Saint Athelwold. The English church developed a distinctive character, respected across Europe for its learning. English missionaries and scholars traveled to the continent, while foreign rulers sought English clerics for their own courts. A national consciousness, kindled by Alfred, was now aflame. The kingdom was administered through shires and sheriffs, with a sophisticated system of written royal commands. Tribune. English silver pennies became trusted currency from Dublin to Rome. But prosperity bred new vulnerabilities. A unified, wealthy England was a tempting prize. And across the North Sea, the descendants of the Vikings had not forgotten their ambitions. They had become the powerful kings of a unified Denmark. In the 980s, a new wave of attacks began, but this time the enemy was not raiding bands, but the organized might of a state. The English response revealed a system grown weary. The relentless pressure of taxation for defense, the fading memory of the spirit of Eddington, and a series of weak kings left the realm faltering. The Danish king Sweyn Forkbeard, and later his son Nut, found a kingdom that had, in many ways, lost its will. Nut's conquest in 1016 marked the end of the Anglo-Saxon royal line, but not the end of England. Nut was shrewd. He did not smash the machine, he took it over. He ruled as an English king, upholding the good laws of Edgar and Athelstan, marrying the previous king's widow, and embedding himself in the system. His reign proved that the English state was robust, capable of functioning under any ruler who respected its mechanisms. But such a system relied heavily on the strength of the ruler. When Nut's sons failed to match him, the door opened for the return of the Old English dynasty. In 1042, Edward, the son of Athelred, was crowned. He would be known as the Confessor, a man of deep piety. He inherited a kingdom profoundly changed. Decades of Danish rule had left a powerful class of great earls, like the Godwins of Wessex, who commanded private armies rivaling the king's. The church had grown closer to Rome, and England was now irrevocably part of a wider European chessboard. Edward's court was a place of Norman influence, for he had spent his exile in Normandy. When he died childless in January 1066, he left a vacuum and a deadly contest for a crown that now seemed the richest prize in the north. 3 men saw their chance. In Norway, the legendary warrior king Harald Hardrada, a giant of a man who had fought across the world, believed he had an old claim. In Normandy, Duke William, a bastard who had fought his way to absolute control of his duchy, claimed Edward had promised him the throne, and that the most powerful English earl, Harold Godwin's son, had sworn an oath to support him. And in England, that same Harold Godwin's son, brother-in-law to the dead king and the realm's foremost soldier and administrator, was swiftly crowned by the English nobility. 3 claims, 3 armies. 1 year. Harold's reign began with a storm from the north. In September, Hardrada's fleet of 300 ships entered the Humber. At the Battle of Fulford, outside York, they crushed the northern English earls. Harold, in London, acted with lightning speed. He force-marched his army nearly 200 miles north in just 4 days, a feat that stunned contemporaries. He caught the Norwegians utterly by surprise at Stamford Bridge. The battle was a slaughter. Harold Hardrada fell, an arrow in his throat. The Viking age of conquest ended on that field, broken by English arms. But even as Harold celebrated his crushing victory, messengers were riding north with dire news. While he had been fighting in Yorkshire, the wind had finally turned favorable in Normandy. William the Bastard had landed his invasion fleet on the Sussex coast, right in the heart of Harold's own family lands. The king, his army exhausted and bloodied, had to turn around and march south again. He would have to face the most disciplined and innovative military machine in Europe without rest, without his full strength. The 2 armies converged on a ridge near Hastings. Harold's men, foot soldiers armed with axes and spears, formed a solid, towering shield wall atop Senlac Hill. Below, William's force was a combined arms marvel, heavy cavalry in chainmail, professional infantry, and ranks of archers. On October 14, 1066, the future of England was decided. The battle raged for hours. The Norman cavalry charged again and again, hurling themselves against the unyielding English wall. The English held, hewing down horses and men with their great 2-handed axes. A rumor swept the Norman lines that William was dead, and panic nearly turned the day. But William rode through his men, helmet off, shouting that he lived. Then came a masterful tactic, a feigned retreat. A section of the Norman line broke and fled back down the hill. A portion of the English line, believing victory was at hand, broke formation to chase them. It was a fatal mistake. The Norman cavalry wheeled, surrounded the isolated English, and cut them down. The shield wall was breached. As the autumn light faded, Harold Godwin's son, the last Anglo-Saxon king of England, was killed defending his standard. The flower of the English nobility died with him. In one long, brutal afternoon, a world ended. William's march to London was a lesson in psychological domination. He did not rush to claim his crown. Instead, he carved a wide, burning path of destruction through the southeast, a clear message about the price of resistance. By Christmas Day, 1066, he was crowned King of England in Westminster Abbey. Even as the crown was placed on his head, Norman soldiers outside, misunderstanding the shouts of acclamation in English, began setting fire to the surrounding houses. It was an ominous symbol for a reign born in conquest. William had won the crown, but could he hold a kingdom? The English nobility was shattered but not gone. The church was wary. The people were sullen and hostile. The next years would answer the question: was this just another Viking conquest, or the beginning of a transformation that would remake England from its very foundations? The Norman yoke was now upon the land, and its weight would be felt in stone, in law, and in blood. The crown William wore was heavy with more than gold. It was weighted with the suspicion of a conquered people and the restless ambition of the Norman barons who had followed him for a promise of land. He had taken England in a battle, but ruling it would be a war of a different kind. The first great rebellion erupted in 1067, while William was away in Normandy displaying his trophies. The remaining English earls, seeing their chance, rose up. In the north, Edgar the Atheling, the last male of the ancient royal bloodline, was proclaimed king. It was a coordinated strike to strangle the new regime in its cradle, to overwhelm the scattered Norman garrisons before reinforcements could cross the Channel. William returned not as a magnanimous victor, but as an avenging storm. The campaign that followed was a lesson in calculated terror. This was not battle, it was pacification. Villages were put to the torch, harvests destroyed, livestock slaughtered. The message was carved into the landscape itself: resistance leads only to ashes. The most brutal chapter was written in the winter of 1069, during the harrying of the north. A major rebellion in Yorkshire, supported by a Danish fleet, threatened to unravel everything. William's response was utter devastation. For months, his forces systematically made the land incapable of supporting life. Mills were smashed, salt sown in fields, and populations fled south as refugees, carrying tales of a wasteland where no hearth smoke rose. The psychological shockwave silenced further rebellion. William would rather rule a desert than tolerate defiance. Yet even as he demonstrated this terrifying capacity for violence, he was building something unprecedented. He imposed a new system upon every inch of English soil: feudalism. All land now belonged to the king, held by his barons in exchange for military service, and they in turn granted it to knights and farmers. It created a pyramid of obligation, with the crown at its apex. To understand this new kingdom, he needed an inventory. The result was the Doomsday Book, a survey of such breathtaking scope it stunned contemporaries. Commissioners traveled the land, asking questions of every village. Who held it? How many plows? How many pigs? What was it worth? It was more than a tax record. It was the first X-ray of a nation, a map of power and wealth drawn on parchment. The Norman aristocracy planted itself in the earth with stone. Castles rose at strategic points, first simple mounds of earth topped with wooden towers, moats and baileys, then later, immense keeps of rugged stone. They were not just military bases but symbols of a new, permanent order. The White Tower of London, begun by William himself, was the ultimate statement. A fortress, a palace, a treasury, and a prison all in one, its pale stone declaring Norman mastery over the English skyline. The church, too, was remade in a Norman image. The old Anglo-Saxon bishops were replaced with Norman clerics. Lanfranc, the new Archbishop of Canterbury, was a brilliant administrator who reformed the English church to align with Rome. The small wooden Saxon churches were torn down, and in their place rose massive cathedrals like Durham, with arches that seemed to strain towards heaven, built by the latest European techniques. It was an architectural revolution in stone and faith. Perhaps the most profound change was in the very air people spoke. A trilingual society emerged: Latin for the church and law, the rough music of English for the common folk, and the sharp, courtly language of French for the new rulers. Over centuries, these streams would blend to form the deep, rich river of modern English. The legal system was centralized, with royal judges traveling circuits to dispense the king's justice, slowly weaving local customs into a common law for all. The economy was transformed, systematized for greater yield, with English wool becoming a coveted treasure across Europe. Jewish communities, invited by William to provide financial services forbidden to Christians, established the credit networks that fueled this new growth. But the human cost was etched deep. The cultural divide between Norman lord and English peasant was a chasm. The forests, once common land, became royal hunting preserves under savage new laws. The weight of feudal service pressed down on the shoulders of the plowman. This was the conflicted legacy William left when he died in 1087, dividing his lands: Normandy to his eldest son Robert, England to his second son, William Rufus. Rufus was a king of appetites, for money, for hunting, for power. He treated the church as a purse to be emptied, selling bishoprics and leaving seats vacant to pocket their income. His reign was one of friction and fear. His death in 1100, struck by an arrow in a New Forest hunting accident that many suspected was murder, brought his younger brother Henry to the throne. Henry I was a different man, a shrewd administrator. He issued a coronation charter, promising to rule justly and remedy the abuses of his brother, an early nod to the idea that a king's power had limits. He perfected the machinery of government, most notably the exchequer, where sheriffs came each year to account for their shire's revenues on a checkered cloth, the king's financial brain taking precise form. He married a princess of the old Saxon bloodline, Edith of Scotland, a symbolic union of conqueror and conquered that promised healing. For a time it worked. England grew prosperous and stable, but tragedy waited at sea. In 1120, the White Ship, carrying Henry's only legitimate son and heir, William Etheling, and the flower of young Anglo-Norman nobility, struck a rock and sank. The king's grief was bottomless. The political catastrophe was absolute. With no male heir, Henry forced his barons to swear allegiance to his daughter, Matilda. It was an unprecedented demand, to accept a woman as sovereign. The barons swore, but uneasily. When Henry died in 1135, that unease became betrayal. His nephew, Stephen of Blois, moved with swift, decisive greed. He seized the treasury and had himself crowned, arguing that the realm could not be left to a woman. The barons, preferring a weak king they could control to a strong queen they could not, mostly rallied to him. Matilda, however, was not a woman to accept defeat. She was an empress, widow of the Holy Roman Emperor, a politician and leader of steel. What followed was not a simple dispute, but a descent into a period remembered as the Anarchy, a 19-year civil war where Christ and his saints slept. Castles of illegal wood and earth sprang up like poisonous mushrooms, their lords terrorizing the countryside. Royal authority evaporated. Contemporary chroniclers wrote of a land where the strong devoured the weak without restraint. It was the ultimate test of the Norman system. Could the institutions of government survive the collapse of the king's personal power? Remarkably, fragments did. The exchequer kept partial records. The idea of the common law persisted. The war ended not in conquest, but in exhausted negotiation. By the Treaty of Wallingford in 1153, Stephen would remain king for life, but Matilda's son, Henry, would succeed him. When Stephen died a year later, the young Henry Plantagenet ascended the throne as Henry II. He inherited a scarred and weary kingdom, but he also brought with him an empire. Through inheritance and marriage to the formidable Eleanor of Aquitaine, he ruled lands stretching from the Scottish border to the Pyrenees. He was perhaps the most powerful man in Western Europe, and he possessed a relentless, brilliant mind for order. Henry II's mission was restoration and reform. He tore down the illegal castles of the anarchy. He restored the coinage. And he launched a legal revolution that would change England forever. He sent royal judges out on regular circuits, and he developed a system of standardized writs, royal commands that initiated legal actions. If your land was seized, you could purchase a writ from the king's chancery to get a hearing in a royal court. This offered justice that was more uniform and potentially fairer than that of local feudal courts. Gradually, the decisions of these itinerant judges began to form a consistent body of law, the common law, common to all of England. But this expansion of royal justice brought him into ferocious conflict with an old friend. Thomas Becket, his chancellor and boon companion, was made Archbishop of Canterbury in the hope he would help Henry control the church. Instead, Becket underwent a dramatic transformation, becoming a fierce defender of ecclesiastical independence. The clash centered on where clergy who committed crimes should be tried, in royal courts or church courts. The constitutions of Clarendon in 1164 tried to formalize royal authority over the church. Becket resisted, fled into exile, and returned years later only for the conflict to explode again. In a fit of rage, Henry famously cried out, "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" For knights took him at his word. They rode to Canterbury and murdered Becket before his own altar. The shock Christendom was profound. Becket was instantly venerated as a martyr. Henry, in a masterpiece of political penance, walked barefoot to Canterbury, submitted to a scourging by the monks, and spent a night in prayer at the tomb. The saint had, in death, humbled the king. But the law, Henry's great project, marched on. It was a system built to last, but it could not survive the failure of his own family. Henry's sons, Henry the young king, Richard, Geoffrey, and John, chafed under their father's controlling hand. Encouraged by their mother, Eleanor, and by the King of France, they rebelled repeatedly. The old king, worn out by war with his own blood, died in 1189, defeated and heartbroken. The empire passed to his son Richard, a figure who seemed sprung from the pages of romance. Where Henry was a bureaucrat genius, Richard was the archetypal night king, a soldier of phenomenal skill and negligible interest in the daily grind of governance. His heart lay not in England, but in the Holy Land. He would spend only a few months of his 10-year reign on English soil, draining its treasury to fund his glorious crusade. His capture and colossal ransom bled the country white, forcing new levels of taxation and administrative innovation. He died in 1199, shot by a crossbow bolt while besieging a trivial castle in France, a king who lived for war and died by it. His successor was the youngest brother, John. Where Richard was neglectful, John was corrosive. He inherited a diminished empire, having lost the great Duchy of Normandy to the French king. He proved to be a clever, suspicious, and vindictive ruler, whose ingenuity was directed at squeezing his subjects for every penny. He exploited feudal law to extort his barons, sold justice, and sparked a confrontation with the powerful Pope Innocent III that led to his excommunication and the entire kingdom being placed under interdict, a profound spiritual crisis where church bells fell silent. By 1215, the barons had enough. They formed a coalition, took London, and cornered the king at Runnymede. There, they forced him to set his seal to a document that would echo through history: Magna Carta, the Great Charter. It was, in its details, a feudal document listing baronial grievances about reliefs and wardships. But its genius lay in its broader principles. Clause 39 declared, "No free man shall be seized or imprisoned, except by the lawful judgment of his peers or by the law of the land." It established that the king was not above the law. It was a fundamental contract between ruler and ruled. John signed it with no intention of keeping his word. He immediately got the Pope to annul it, and civil war erupted again. The barons, in desperation, even invited the French Prince Louis to invade and take the crown. The war was still raging when John, dysentery-ridden and fleeing his own burning baggage train, died at Newark in 1216. He left a kingdom in ruins to his 9-year-old son, Henry III. Yet from this nadir, the system proved its resilience. The regents for the boy king, led by the venerable knight William Marshall, reissued Magna Carta in a modified form, making it a symbol of reconciliation rather than rebellion. The French invasion was repelled. Slowly, painfully, the realm was put back together. The lesson of the 13th century was becoming clear. England was more than its king. It was a community of the realm, with institutions, laws, and a growing sense of self that could, at the very brink, save itself from its own rulers. And as young Henry III grew to manhood, that community would find its voice in a new and powerful way, within the echoing walls of a developing institution called Parliament. But that is a story for another night. The boy king, Henry III, grew up in the shadow of his father's failure, his reign a long attempt to reconcile the soaring dreams of kingship with the hard, new reality of a political community that demanded a say. He was a man of deep, aesthetic piety who loved splendor and sacred ceremony. His greatest monument, the rebuilding of Westminster Abbey in the soaring Gothic style, was a testament to this devotion, a crown of stone meant to rival the great cathedrals of France. Yet its colossal cost, wrung from a kingdom still recovering from civil war, revealed his fatal flaw, a disconnect between his royal vision and his subjects' burdens. That burden grew heavier as Henry's favoritism towards his wife's Savoyard relatives and his own half-brothers from Poitou became impossible to ignore. The barons, who had fought for the principle that the king must govern with counsel, watched in anger as foreigners seemed to plunder the realm. By 1258, their patience snapped. They confronted the king not with armies first, but with a document, the Provisions of Oxford. This was a revolutionary blueprint for government. It established a council of 15 barons to oversee the king, required parliaments to be held 3 times a year, and placed the great officers of state under baronial control. It was an attempt to cage the monarchy within a framework of law and consent. Henry agreed, then schemed to undo it. The result was another war, but this conflict birthed a new and potent idea. The leader of the baronial reform movement was an unlikely figure, Simon de Montfort, Earl of Leicester. A French nobleman by birth, married to the king's sister, he became the most passionate champion of English political community. His conflict with Henry was not merely a power struggle, it was a clash over the nature of sovereignty. In 1264, de Montfort's forces defeated and captured the king at the Battle of Lewes. Suddenly, de Montfort was the ruler of England in the king's name. Faced with the need to legitimize his revolutionary government, he made a decision that would change history. In 1265, he summoned a parliament. But this assembly was different. Alongside the great barons and bishops, he called for 2 knights from every shire and, crucially, 2 burgesses from selected towns. For the first time, the commons, the landed gentry and the prosperous townsmen, were formally summoned to a national council. The voice of the community of the realm grew louder, more complex. It was a moment of extraordinary political imagination. Could the realm speak through representatives? Could the king's government answer to more than just the greatest magnates? De Montfort's experiment was brilliant but brief. His own arrogance and the defection of key allies led to his defeat and gruesome death at the Battle of Evesham in 1265. Yet the genie could not be put back in the bottle. When Henry's son, Edward, returned from crusade to take the throne in 1272, he was a king forged in these fires. Edward I was a lawgiver, a conqueror, and a politician who understood that strength came not from defying the community, but from channeling it. His reign was one of formidable energy. He turned his ambition west, to the last independent Welsh princes. His conquest was methodical and final, sealed by a ring of immense stone castles, Conwy, Carnarvon, Harlech, that were both unbreakable fortresses and symbols of a new, imperial power. He gave the Welsh law, but it was English law. He gave them a prince, but it would be his own son, born at Carnarvon, beginning a tradition. Wales was absorbed. In the north, a crisis of succession in Scotland presented what seemed like a golden opportunity. Edward was asked to arbitrate, but his idea of arbitration looked much like overlordship. The Scottish resistance, first under William Wallace and then Robert the Bruce, turned into a long, brutal war of independence. The battles of Stirling Bridge and Bannockburn would become Scottish legend, proving that the reach of English power had its limits. But Edward's lasting legacy was built in law chambers, not on battlefields. He was called the English Justinian, for a reason. A series of great statutes, of Westminster, of Mortmain, of Quia Emptors, rationalized and codified the common law, touching everything from property rights to court procedure. He made the law a more coherent, powerful tool of royal government, but in doing so, he also strengthened the framework that protected his subjects. And he regularized what de Montfort had pioneered. The model parliament of 1295 included lords, clergy, knights, and burgesses. Edward's motive was practical, not democratic. His vast ambitions, wars in Wales, Scotland, and France, were astronomically expensive. He needed to tap the wealth of the whole nation, and to do that, he needed their consent. What touches all, the summons declared, should be approved by all. Parliament became the place where the king negotiated for taxes, and in return, the commons presented petitions for the redress of grievances. It was a transactional relationship, but it gave the political community a permanent, powerful voice. This financial pressure also led to one of the darker acts of his reign. In 1290, Edward expelled all Jews from England. They had been the king's personal financial resource, forbidden to Christians by usury laws. Indebted to them, Edward simply erased the debt by erasing the lenders. It was an act of economic short-sightedness and religious prejudice that closed a chapter of medieval English life. When Edward I died in 1307, he left a kingdom that was larger, more legally sophisticated, and more deeply in debt than ever. He left, too, a son utterly unlike himself. Edward II was not a warrior or a statesman. He was a man of private passions and public neglect. His intense attachment to a series of favorites, beginning with Piers Gaveston, alienated the baronial elite who saw their traditional role as the king's natural counselors being usurped by upstarts. The ordinances of 1311, imposed by the barons, sought to control the king as they had his grandfather, exiling Gaveston and regulating the royal household. Edward's response was a weak man's defiance. He repealed the ordinances the moment he could, and Gaveston returned, only to be captured and murdered by outraged earls. The king's grief was profound, but so was his political failure. That failure was writ large in blood and disaster in the north. At Bannockburn in 1314, Robert the Bruce's outnumbered Scots army annihilated the forces of Edward II, securing Scottish independence. It was the most shattering military defeat England had suffered in centuries, a humiliation that broke the king's authority completely. The following years saw the kingdom descend into a state of near civil war, as Edward fell under the control of a new, even more rapacious favorite, Hugh Despenser the Younger. The Despensers ruled through terror, using the king's authority to seize lands and crush rivals, turning the machinery of state into a tool for private plunder. The breaking point came from within the king's own family. In 1326, his wife, Queen Isabella, the she-wolf of France, and her lover, the exiled Baron Roger Mortimer, invaded England with a small army. They were met not with resistance, but with open arms. The political community, from magnates to merchants, had had enough. Edward's regime collapsed. He was captured, forced to abdicate in favor of his 14-year-old son, and then, in 1327, secretly murdered in Berkeley Castle by a method so gruesome it became legend, a red-hot poker, leaving no mark on the royal skin. It was a grim testament to how far the bonds of loyalty had decayed. The reign that began with this regicide, that of Edward III, would become the apogee of medieval England's chivalric and military power. The boy king, once a puppet of his mother and Mortimer, seized power in a dramatic coup in 1330. He understood what his father had not, that a king's strength lay in embodying the aspirations of his warrior nobility. He revived the claim to the French throne through his mother, Isabella, and in 1337, plunged England into the great conflict that would span generations, the 100 Years' War. It was a war driven by economics, the wool trade with Flanders, by politics, French support for Scotland, and by a new, potent sense of English national identity. And at first, it was spectacularly successful. Edward was a tactical innovator. At Halidon Hill, 1333, and then, stunningly, at Crecy, 1346, he used the same devastating formula: dismounted men-at-arms forming an anvil, and a hail of arrows from massed longbowmen forming the hammer. The French chivalry, the flower of European knighthood, was cut down. The victory was followed by the epic siege and capture of Calais, giving England a strategic foothold on the continent. Edward cultivated the ideal of chivalry, founding the Order of the Garter, a brotherhood of the realm's greatest warriors centered on the legend of King Arthur. His court was one of tournaments, heraldry, and romance. He was the king who made war glorious and profitable. His son, the Black Prince, became a legend in his own time, winning another miraculous victory at Poitiers in 1356, where he captured the French king himself. But then, in 1348, a shadow fell that no army could fight. The Black Death swept into England from the continent. It was apocalyptic. In less than 2 years, it killed perhaps half the population. The social and economic foundations of the medieval world trembled and cracked. Labor became scarce. Peasants, who had been bound to the land, found they could demand wages for their work. The old certainties of the feudal order began to dissolve. The Statute of Laborers in 1351 tried to freeze wages and force people back into their old places, but it was like trying to command the tide. The world had changed. Edward III's long reign ended in sadness. The Black Prince died before him, and the king himself slipped into a dotage controlled by a grasping mistress. When he died in 1377, he left the throne to the Black Prince's son, a 10-year-old boy, Richard II. The glory days were over. The bill for the long, costly war was coming due. The social tensions bottled up since the plague were reaching a breaking point. And a child king sat on the throne, surrounded by jealous uncles and a political community that had grown accustomed to wielding power. The stage was set not for foreign conquest, but for a revolutionary storm that would arise from the plowed fields of England itself. The medieval order, so carefully built and so violently shaken, was about to face its greatest challenge from within. The child who became King Richard II inherited a crown tarnished by financial exhaustion and a realm simmering with profound discontent. The long, costly war with France had stalled, draining the treasury while filling the country with discharged soldiers accustomed to violence. The deep social wound left by the Black Death had never healed. The old feudal hierarchy was crumbling, and the peasants who survived the plague knew their labor was now valuable. When the government imposed a new, brutal poll tax, the same amount due from duke and dirt-poor farmer alike, the spark met the tinder. In the spring of 1381, the revolt exploded. It was not a mere riot, but a coordinated uprising that swept from Kent and Essex towards London. Led by figures like Wat Tyler and the radical preacher John Ball, who asked, "When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman?" Their demands were revolutionary. An end to serfdom, the abolition of noble privileges, the disendowment of the church. They sought a world turned upside down. They stormed London, burning the palaces of hated officials, freeing prisoners from the Marshalsea, and executing the Archbishop of Canterbury. At this moment of supreme crisis, the 14-year-old king displayed astonishing courage. He agreed to meet the rebels at Mile End. From the safety of the tower, he rode out into the seething mass of armed, angry men. It was a breathtaking gamble. At Smithfield, facing Wat Tyler, Richard reportedly said, "I will be your captain." He issued charters promising their demands. When Tyler was killed in a scuffle, Richard alone prevented a massacre, riding forward and shouting, "You shall have no captain but me." He led the mob away, and with a combination of promised pardons and ruthless subsequent betrayal, the revolt was crushed. But the memory of the king's solitary courage and the sheer terror of the mob's power would never leave the English political imagination. Richard grew into a complex, cultured, and increasingly authoritarian man. He loved art and ceremony, building Westminster Hall's magnificent hammerbeam roof as a stage for His Majesty. He believed passionately in the sacred, untouchable nature of kingship, a direct rebuttal to the rebellious forces he had witnessed. After the political crises of his minority, he spent years carefully rebuilding royal power, creating a court party of loyalists and using legal technicalities to destroy his enemies, like the Lord's Appellant who had once constrained him. By the late 1390s, he ruled as a near tyrant. He forced loans from his subjects, demanded blank charters, and exiled or executed his perceived foes, including his own cousin, Henry of Bolingbroke. When Bolingbroke's father, John of Gaunt, died, Richard committed his final, fatal error. He disinherited Bolingbroke and seized the vast Lancastrian estates. At that moment, Richard was in Ireland, putting down a rebellion. Bolingbroke, now an aggrieved exile with nothing left to lose, landed in Yorkshire, claiming only his rightful inheritance. He was met not with armies, but with defections. The political community, nobility and commons alike, had been alienated by Richard's capricious rule. They flocked to Bolingbroke. By the time Richard returned, his support had evaporated. He was captured, conveyed to the Tower, and forced to abdicate. In 1399, Parliament assembled not to advise the king, but to depose him. Articles of accusation were read. Richard's reign was declared void. This was no feudal rebellion, but a constitutional revolution. The crown was offered to Henry Bolingbroke, who became Henry IV. His claim was a shaky mixture of conquest, hereditary right, and, crucially, parliamentary sanction. The divine right of kings had been punctured by the will of the political community. Henry IV's reign was a constant, wearying fight to legitimize what he had taken. Rebellion was his inheritance. The Welsh, under Owain Glyndwr, rose in a fierce national struggle. The powerful Percy family of the north, who had helped him to the throne, turned against him, defeated only at the bloody Battle of Shrewsbury. The king was plagued by illness and financial desperation, becoming more reliant on Parliament for grants of money, which in turn gave the Commons more leverage. The precedent of 1399 hung over everything. If one king could be removed, why not another? It was his son, Henry V, who mastered the dilemma. Where his father ruled by weary calculation, Henry V ruled by glorious purpose. He embodied the chivalric and martial ideals that had lain dormant since Edward III. He revived the claim to France with a cold, legalistic fervor and a modern, disciplined army. In 1415, at Agincourt, his outnumbered, tired, and dysentery-ridden force faced the colossal chivalry of France. The result was not a battle but a slaughter. The English longbowmen, protected by a field of sharpened stakes, unleashed a storm of arrows that choked the French advance in a muddy killing ground. The French nobility died in heaps. It was a victory that seemed to prove God's favor on the English cause and the Lancastrian dynasty. Henry became a national legend overnight. He followed Agincourt with a meticulous, grinding conquest of Normandy. By the Treaty of Troyes in 1420, he achieved the impossible. He was recognized as heir to the French throne, marrying the French princess Catherine. The double monarchy of England and France seemed within grasp. But 2 years later, Henry V was dead, felled by disease at the Siege of Meaux. He left his gains not to a warrior king, but to a 9-month-old infant, Henry VI. The long minority that followed slowly unraveled everything. In France, a mysterious young woman named Joan appeared at the court of the disinherited French dauphin. Claiming divine voices, she lifted the siege of Orleans, shattered the myth of English invincibility, and had the dauphin crowned King Charles VII at Reims. Though Joan was captured and burned by the English, the momentum had shifted. The French learned to avoid pitched battles, and slowly, relentlessly, they pushed the English back. The cost of holding on to continental territory bled England white. Worse was the nature of the king who finally assumed personal rule. Henry VI was pious, gentle, and completely unsuited to rule. He was prone to catatonic stupors, the first of which struck in 1453, the same year the English were finally driven from all of France except Calais. The loss of the French Empire was a psychic shock that broke the prestige of the Lancastrian dynasty. With a king who was literally incapable of governing, the kingdom descended into a factional fight for control between two powerful royal cousins, Richard, Duke of York, and the king's own Lancastrian court party, led by the formidable Queen Margaret. York claimed a better right to the crown through his descent from Edward III's second son. The conflict began with political maneuvering but soon escalated into violence. At the First Battle of St. Albans in 1455, York's forces killed the king's chief ministers and took the king himself captive. This was not yet a war for the crown, but a struggle to control it. 4 years, an uneasy peace and sporadic violence flickered across England. The storm fully broke in 1460. York formally claimed the throne. Though a compromise was struck allowing Henry VI to reign for life with York as his heir, Queen Margaret refused to disinherit her own son. She raised a Lancastrian army in the north. At the Battle of Wakefield, York was killed, his head mockingly crowned with a paper coronet and placed on the walls of York. But his cause did not die. It passed to his formidable 18-year-old son, Edward. Edward of York was everything Henry VI was not: tall, handsome, charismatic, and a brilliant soldier. In 1461, he crushed the Lancastrians at the brutal, snow-blinded Battle of Towton, the bloodiest ever fought on English soil. Henry, Margaret, and their son fled into exile. Edward was crowned Edward IV. The Yorkist sun had risen. Edward's first reign was a period of recovery and strong rule. He was a capable administrator, promoting trade and restoring royal finances. But he made a shocking, secret marriage to Elizabeth Woodville, a beautiful widow of Lancastrian lineage. This alienated his most powerful ally, Richard Neville, the Earl of Warwick, the Kingmaker. Warwick's pride was mortally wounded, and his strategic vision of a French alliance through a royal marriage was ruined. Warwick switched sides, orchestrating a stunning comeback for the exiled Lancastrians. In 1470, he forced Edward to flee and restored the hapless Henry VI to the throne, a puppet king for a second time. But Edward IV was a king of resilience. He returned the following year, allied with his estranged brother, the Duke of Clarence. In two swift, vicious battles, Barnet and Tewkesbury, he destroyed the Lancastrian cause. At Tewkesbury, Henry VI's son and heir was killed. Weeks later, the imprisoned Henry VI himself was murdered in the Tower of London, almost certainly on Edward's orders. The direct Lancastrian line was extinguished. Edward's second reign was secure, a time of commercial prosperity and cultural flowering, the world of the merchant class and the early Renaissance. When Edward died unexpectedly in 1483, the crown passed to his 12-year-old son, Edward V. But the boy's uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, acted with ruthless speed. He seized the young king and his brother, declaring them illegitimate and taking the crown for himself as Richard III. The princes in the Tower vanished, and a thick cloud of suspicion has hung over Richard ever since. His usurpation shattered the Yorkist consensus. Within 2 years, a new challenger emerged from exile in Brittany, Henry Tudor, a sprig of the distant Lancastrian line through his mother. He promised to marry Edward IV's daughter, Elizabeth of York, and unite the warring Roses. In August 1485, Henry Tudor landed in Wales. The two armies met at Bosworth Field. The battle was a confused melee of treachery. Richard III, fighting with desperate courage, saw his key ally, Lord Stanley, hold back. Then Stanley's forces charged against the king. Richard, crying treason, plunged into the fray towards Henry Tudor's standard. He was cut down. His crown was found in a hawthorn bush and placed on Henry Tudor's head. The Plantagenet dynasty, which had ruled for over 300 years, was over. As the sun set on the field at Bosworth, a new dynasty began. The medieval age, with its feudal loyalties, its chivalric codes, and its wars of dynastic possession, had reached its bloody conclusion. The England that Henry VII would work to rebuild was exhausted by war but hardened by its long journey. It had the institutions, a common law, a parliament, a sense of national identity, forged in the fires of those centuries. The story of how a collection of tribes became a kingdom, how a kingdom survived conquest and plagues and civil wars, had reached a turning point. The centralized, early modern state was waiting to be born from the ashes of the Roses. The long, complex, and magnificent tapestry of medieval England was complete. Its final threads, stained with the mud of Bosworth, were now knotted. A silence fell, deeper than the silence after Rome's departure, heavy with the end of an era and the quiet, uncertain dawn of the next. The silence after Bosworth was not the quiet of peace, but the stillness of exhaustion and wary calculation. Henry Tudor, now Henry VII, surveyed a kingdom bled pale by 3 decades of intermittent civil war. The crown he had plucked from a thorn bush was a fragile, contested thing. The noble families who had spent a generation tearing each other apart now watched this unknown Welshman with distant royal blood, wondering if he was merely another piece to be moved in their great game, or the player who would finally change the rules. Henry was determined to be the latter. His mission was not glory, but survival, and to make survival permanent. He would build a new kind of throne, not on the shifting sands of feudal loyalty, but on the solid ground of administrative control, financial solvency, and political fear. The first task was to eliminate rival claims. He honored his pledge to marry Elizabeth of York, uniting the red rose of Lancaster with the white rose of York. This symbolic union was powerful, but Henry ensured the son of York would not outshine his own Tudor star. He dated his reign from the day before Bosworth, making anyone who fought against him a traitor. He imprisoned the last direct Yorkist male heir, the young Earl of Warwick, in the Tower. When a pretender, Lambert Simnel, claimed to be Warwick and raised a rebellion, Henry crushed it at the Battle of Stoke in 1487, the last dying gasp of the true Wars of the Roses. Later, a more dangerous impostor, Perkin Warbeck, claimed to be one of the vanished princes in the Tower. He twisted through the courts of Europe for years, a ghost of Yorkist legitimacy, before his capture and execution. Henry understood that legitimacy was not just about blood. It was about perception, control, and the ruthless elimination of alternatives. His true genius, however, was not on the battlefield but in the counting house. The medieval monarchy had always been financially precarious, living hand-to-mouth on feudal dues and parliamentary taxes voted for war. Henry made the crown rich. He exploited every feudal right to the fullest: wardships, marriages, reliefs. He encouraged trade to boost customs revenue. He personally scrutinized account books, signing off on even minor expenses. He promoted the use of justices of the peace, local gentry empowered to keep order, as a cheap and effective way of governing the shires, binding this crucial class to the crown's authority. He avoided expensive foreign wars. The result was a transformation. He left a full treasury, a solvent government. Money meant independence from parliamentary grants and overmighty nobles. For the first time in centuries, the king was arguably the richest man in his kingdom, not the indebted first among quarrelsome equals. This new monarchy required new men. Henry bypassed the old, battle-scarred aristocracy and elevated lawyers, administrators, and merchants, men whose power flowed entirely from him. Counselors like Sir Reginald Bray and Archbishop John Morton created a system of bonds and recognizances, legal agreements where nobles pledged huge sums of money as guarantees of good behavior. Break your word, forfeit your fortune. It was government through enforced loyalty, a financial leash on the nobility. The Court of Star Chamber, meeting in a room with a star-painted ceiling, became his tool for trying powerful men who corrupted local justice or threatened the peace, using royal prerogative rather than common law to deliver swift, decisive verdicts. Yet for all his tight-fisted control, Henry's reign fostered the conditions in which the medieval world truly gave way to the early modern. The printing press, introduced by William Caxton during the wars, now quietly revolutionized the spread of ideas. Scholars inspired by the Italian Renaissance, like Thomas Linacre and John Colet, brought new learning to Oxford and Cambridge. The architecture of his new chapel at Westminster Abbey and the magnificent palace he began at Richmond spoke a new visual language of refined, classical-inspired power, distinct from the fortified keeps of the barons or the perpendicular grandeur of late Gothic churches. When Henry VII died in 1509, he passed to his son, Henry VIII, a kingdom that was stable, wealthy, and at peace. He had snuffed out the embers of civil war not with charisma, but with ledgers and lawyers. The fierce, personal feudalism of the Middle Ages was spent. In its place was the scaffolding of a strong, centralized state. But this stable throne now supported a king of a completely different temperament. Henry VIII was young, handsome, learned, athletic. A Renaissance prince who saw kingship not as a burdensome duty of accounting, but as a stage for magnificence, power, and personal will. His father had secured the monarchy's body. The son would embark on a tumultuous quest that would redefine its soul, and in doing so, sever England forever from the shared spiritual community of medieval Christendom. The early years of Henry VIII's reign were a glittering festival of chivalry revived. He jousted, composed music, patronized scholars like Thomas More, and pursued glory in war against France, winning the empty but noisy Battle of the Spurs. His chief minister, Cardinal Thomas Wolsey, a butcher's son risen by his wits, managed the kingdom with vast energy, dreaming of making England the arbiter of Europe. For a time, it seemed the new age would be one of cultured splendor. But the great matter that would shatter this illusion was profoundly personal. Henry needed a male heir. His marriage to Catherine of Aragon, his brother's widow, had produced only one surviving child, a daughter, Mary. Years of secret anxiety turned to desperate resolve. Citing a biblical prohibition, Henry became convinced his marriage was cursed, invalid. He petitioned the Pope for an annulment. The question was no longer just dynastic, it was a test of authority. Was the Pope, a distant prince enmeshed in European politics, the final arbiter of an English king's conscience and succession? The Pope, under the thumb of Catherine's nephew, the Holy Roman Emperor, delayed. Wolsey failed to deliver the annulment and fell from power, dying en route to trial for treason. Into the vacuum stepped a cold, brilliant lawyer and Protestant-sympathizing intellectual, Thomas Cromwell. Cromwell saw a path through the impasse. If the Pope would not act, then the Pope's authority in England must be ended. What began as a king's personal dilemma became a constitutional and religious revolution. Through a relentless, parliamentary campaign between 1529 and 1534, Cromwell engineered the break with Rome. The Act in Restraint of Appeals declared England an empire whose sovereign needed no foreign jurisdiction. The Act of Supremacy made Henry, not the Pope, the supreme head on earth of the Church of England. The ancient loyalty to Roman Catholicism, the framework of medieval spiritual life, was legally severed. The dissolution of the monasteries followed, a staggering act of state-sponsored destruction and redistribution of wealth. The great abbeys, those centuries-old centers of prayer, learning, and charity, were stripped of their lead roofs, their libraries scattered, their lands sold off to create a new class of gentry irrevocably tied to the Tudor regime. The physical and spiritual landscape of England was altered forever. Resistance was met with terrifying force. The saintly Thomas More, Henry's old friend, and the stalwart Bishop John Fisher lost their heads for refusing the oath of supremacy. The Pilgrimage of Grace, a massive popular uprising in the north fueled by devotion to the old faith and economic grievance, was put down with promises and then with executions. Henry's will was law, and the law was enforced by the axe. Henry's subsequent marriages, to Anne Boleyn, mother of Elizabeth, executed, Jane Seymour, mother of Edward, died, and of Cleves, divorced, Catherine Howard, executed, and Catherine Parr, who survived him, became a grim drumbeat underscoring his obsession with control and succession. The king who had been a graceful Renaissance prince became a vast, ailing tyrant, his body decaying as he micromanaged theology, insisting on a Catholic doctrine without the Pope. The medieval unity of Christendom was broken. The English Church was now a national institution, its doctrine defined by royal proclamation, its wealth in the hands of the crown and its allies. When Henry VIII died in 1547, he left a kingdom transformed in its very essence. He left a child king, Edward VI, and a regency council dominated by Protestant reformers who accelerated the religious revolution. The Book of Common Prayer, in English, replaced the Latin Mass. Stone altars were torn out, whitewashed walls covered medieval frescoes. When the sickly Edward died in 1553, his Catholic half-sister Mary attempted to wrench the country back to Rome. Her brutal persecutions earned her the name Bloody Mary, and only served to blacken the Catholic cause in English minds. Her marriage to Philip of Spain made England a satellite of the great Habsburg power, a vision utterly at odds with the independent empire her father had proclaimed. And then, in 1558, came Elizabeth. The daughter of Anne Boleyn, declared illegitimate by Rome and nearly destroyed by her sister's reign, ascended the throne. Her long reign would answer the questions the tumultuous century had posed. What was the Church of England? A moderate Protestant settlement, Catholic in structure but reformed in theology, enforced by law. What was England's place in the world? Not as part of a universal Catholic community, nor as a pawn of Spain, but as a sovereign, defiantly independent Protestant nation-state. The Spanish Armada of 1588, sent to overthrow her, was defeated by English seamanship, Dutch allies, and a providential storm, interpreted as divine favor for this new path. The Elizabethan age saw the flowering of the seeds planted, often in violence, by her father and grandfather. The wealth from dissolved monastic lands and New World ventures fueled a commercial explosion. The sense of national destiny, forged in the fires of the Reformation and the triumph over Spain, found immortal voice in the works of Shakespeare, Spenser, and Marlowe. The medieval worldview, of a fixed, God-ordained hierarchy under a universal church, had been replaced by a new, more restless, more individualistic, and more nationalistic spirit. When Elizabeth, the last Tudor, died in 1603, the crown passed peacefully to James Stuart of Scotland. The kingdom he inherited was unrecognizable to a time traveler from the age of Henry VII. Parliament, though often vexatious to Tudor monarchs, was a powerful, established institution. A unified common law governed the land. A distinct Protestant religious identity was entrenched. A powerful navy guarded the coasts. A vibrant, questioning literary culture thrived. The fears of overmighty nobles that had sparked the Wars of the Roses had been tamed, their castles now often elegant homes, their private armies illegal. The journey from the mist-shrouded, faction-riven land of 1485 to this confident, contentious, and globally minded kingdom of 1603 was the work of a dynasty that had systematically dismantled the medieval order and built something new in its place. They had traded the concept of a king as feudal lord for that of a sovereign as head of state and church. They had replaced local loyalties with a growing sense of national interest. They had exchanged the universal Latin of the cloister for the robust, expansive English of the Bible and the stage. The story that began with Roman legions departing and Saxon sails appearing had, through 1,000 years of struggle, synthesis, and sudden rupture, arrived here. The tapestry was complete, its final scenes no longer depicting knights in armor fighting for a crown in an English field, but sailors and poets and parliament men looking out to a wider ocean, carrying with them the laws, the language, and the stubborn, hard-won identity of an island that had, through its long and painful medieval sleep, finally dreamt itself into a nation. In the stillness following the last Tudor, a new dynasty from the north quietly took the throne. James VI of Scotland became James I of England, uniting the crowns of ancient enemies. He arrived in London, a kingdom profoundly changed from its medieval past, yet still wrestling with its ghosts. The absolute sovereignty Henry VIII had claimed now met a political nation that believed deeply in its own ancient rights and liberties, enshrined in law and parliament. The religious settlement Elizabeth had forged was a tense compromise, dissatisfying to radicals who wanted it purified of all Catholic rags, and to traditionalists who still yearned for the old universal faith. The medieval questions of authority, where does the king's power end and the subjects begin, had not been solved by the Tudors, only reframed. James, a scholar king, believed fervently in the divine right of kings, a theory that seemed to stretch back past the Normans to biblical kingship itself. He told Parliament, "I am the husband, and the whole island is my lawful wife." But the English Parliament, grown in confidence through a century of Reformation statutes, saw itself not as a mere spouse, but as a partner in governance. They guarded their privilege to free speech and their control over taxation. The first sparks of a new kind of conflict, constitutional rather than dynastic, began to fly. When James's son, Charles I, inherited in 1625, these sparks found tinder in his personality. Charles was aloof, inflexible, and saw opposition not as politics but as disloyalty. He believed in order and beauty, patronizing the glorious art of Van Dyck, but he fatally misunderstood the messy reality of English political consent. For 11 years, he tried to rule without parliament, raising money through dubious ancient levies like ship money, extended from coastal towns to the whole country. It was efficient, but to the gentry and lawyers, it was tyranny, taxation without representation. Worse, his religious policies, influenced by his high church archbishop, William Laud, seemed to many a stealthy return to Rome. The gulf widened until, in 1642, king and parliament raised their standards against each other. The English Civil War had begun. It was not a war of roses, a dynastic spat between noble cousins. It was an ideological war, fought over the very soul of the nation's government. Medieval battles had been clashes of retinues. This was a war of ideas made manifest in musket and pike. The Parliament's victory, engineered by the new model army and its iron-willed genius, Oliver Cromwell, led to the unthinkable. In 1649, after a trial conducted in the name of the people of England, Charles I was executed for treason against his own kingdom. The medieval concept of the king's two bodies, the mortal body and the immortal body politic, was violently split. The mortal body was beheaded on a scaffold at Whitehall. The body politic was declared a commonwealth and free state. For a moment, the arc of history that had bent for centuries towards centralized royal power snapped back with revolutionary force. England was a republic. Cromwell's rule as Lord Protector was efficient, puritanical, and ultimately unsustainable. The military dictatorship that replaced the monarchy could not root itself in ancient law or custom. When Cromwell died, the experiment collapsed. In 1660, the monarchy was restored with Charles II. But it was a restoration with a profound difference. The king had been killed by his people. That memory could not be erased. The merry, cynical Charles II understood this. He practiced a politics of charm and evasion, avoiding direct confrontations. But the underlying tensions between Crown and Parliament, between Anglican and Dissenter, simmered. They boiled over again in the reign of his brother, James II, a devout Catholic. James's attempts to promote religious tolerance and pack the army with Catholic officers were seen as a prelude to absolute, popish rule. The political nation, across Whig and Tory divides, acted with decisive unity. In 1688, they invited James's Protestant son-in-law, William of Orange, to invade. James fled. This was the Glorious Revolution, glorious because it was nearly bloodless. It was not a popular uprising, but a transfer of power engineered by the political elite. Its settlement, however, was revolutionary. The Bill of Rights of 1689 legally established that the king ruled not by divine right, but by the will of Parliament. It barred a Catholic monarch, guaranteed free elections and parliamentary speech, and forbade the suspension of laws without consent. The crown was now a constitutional office. The medieval struggle was over. The sovereign's power was formally limited, Parliament was supreme. The energy of the nation, no longer consumed by internal wars over the nature of authority, turned explosively outward. The 18th century became the age of empire, industry, and intellectual revolution. The financial innovations that funded the wars against Louis XIV's France, the Bank of England, the national debt, created a new kind of fiscal military state. The Act of Union with Scotland in 1707 created a new entity, Great Britain. The landscape itself transformed. The open fields and commons of medieval village life were enclosed by parliamentary acts, forcing peasants off the land and into the growing, filthy, vibrant cities. The first fires of the Industrial Revolution were lit in the Midlands, burning with coal, not wood. The rhythm of life was set no longer by the monastic bell and the agricultural season, but by the factory clock and the trade cycle. The philosophical minds of the Enlightenment, Locke, Hume, Smith, provided the intellectual framework for this new world of contracts, rights, commerce, and reason, systematically dismantling the medieval worldview of hierarchy, privilege, and divine mandate. And through it all, the old medieval bones of England persisted, repurposed. The Gothic cathedrals still stood, but now as monuments to a national, Protestant heritage rather than portals to a universal Catholic heaven. The common law, that medieval growth of precedent and custom, adapted to govern patents, contracts, and corporate entities. Parliament, born in the 13th century as the King's Council for raising taxes, became the engine of reform and the sovereign legislative power. The English language, forged in Anglo-Saxon halls, enriched by Norman French and standardized by Caxton's press, became the vehicle for Newton's physics, Austen's novels, and the debates of democracy. By the time the first steam locomotives crossed the countryside in the 19th century, the medieval world was not just gone, it was romanticized, a source of legend and national myth. The Victorians looked back on the Middle Ages with nostalgic fascination, building neo-Gothic parliament buildings and writing tales of chivalric knights, seeing in that distant past a moral certainty they felt their industrial age had lost. They did not see the brutality, the scarcity, the fragility. They saw a story of origin. And that is the final legacy of medieval England. It was the forge. In its fires, through conquest, plague, rebellion, and slow accretion, the raw materials of a nation were hammered into shape. A unified legal system, a representative institution, a distinct language, a stubborn sense of particular identity. The Tudors then tempered that blade, and the conflicts of the 17th century honed its edge. What emerged was a tool uniquely capable of building an empire, pioneering industry, and experimenting with government.